This is Fans on the Run, a podcast made by, for, and about Beatles fans. And now, here's your host, Ethan Alexander.
Ho, 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 ho! Welcome back to Fans on the Run. It's actually the Christmas episode. You'd think after a year of going at it hard and fast, that's what she said. Oh, God. I really don't know how to start these shows, do I? But there you go. And, we actually made it to the end of 2020. Who'd have thunk? If you had said to some people in March that we would have made it to the end of the year, they may be a little surprised. But you know what? We're a strong people, and you should be proud of yourself for getting through the year, because it hasn't been easy for anyone. But I digress. These intros tend to be a little rambly, so you know what to expect. But boy, do we have an episode for you today. This is someone who I've always wanted to talk to, and it's like the quote from the movie, every time a bell rings, a podcast meets some wings. See what I did there? That was a pun. I hate puns, but I made one. If you're listening to the show, I don't have to introduce who this is, but I will anyway, because I have a bit of fun doing these intros. Oh god, I love being able to say this. He is a 2-time Grammy Award-winning musician, songwriter, composer, and lute player? Or what is the word for someone who plays the lute? Is there a word for that?
Lutenist.
Lutenist.
Yeah.
Again, Fans on the Run, the show where you learn something.
You know, it's weird. For the lute, it's a lutenist, but for the flute, it's a flautist. So I guess, loutist wouldn't be quite right somehow.
Again, you learn something new every day. His newest album, the fourth in a series of fantastic Beatle cover albums, and it's called The Fab Fourth. You can find it wherever good music can be heard these days. It's Laurence Juber. Laurence, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, it is, of course, we'll pretend it's Christmas, because whenever this goes up, it is Christmas. So, I want to ask... It's
always Christmas somewhere.
That is probably incorrect, but it is also correct at the same time.
25%, 1/4 of the entire music market is Christmas music.
Well, I want to actually ask you something first, because on the show, it's usually kind of Beatles-centric, but I like talking about other things. I want to ask you, what is your favorite Christmas album, other than the one you're working on?
Of the ones I played on, my favorite is Crazy for Christmas, which was the Dan Hicks and the Hot Licks. I was a hot lick for a day.
You were a hot lick.
Yeah, that's a fun album. Yeah, I mean, I've played on a lot of Christmas albums over the years, so I don't know. You kind of put me on the spot. I'm always on the spot when people ask me to say what my favorite of anything is, because it can change.
Well, I'll ask, what is one of your favorites?
That's a fun Christmas album.
Yeah. Well, I recommend everyone out there. Again, my tongue is tied because I am very excited. I encourage everyone else out there to go listen to this. Oh, you are not the first person who has said that. Preparing for this, I did what I occasionally do sometimes when I'm really stressed. I put on one of my favorite albums to, relax to. It's this cover album of Beatles fingerstyle guitar stuff. The guitarist, I can't put my finger on the name of the guy. I think he was a hot lick for a day.
Yeah, I've done 4 of those albums.
And they're all fantastic.
Well, I'm glad you like them. It wasn't what I intended to do at all. I started off, when I really got deeply into doing solo fingerstyle guitar, I started off as a composer, not as an arranger. And I had done a number of albums that were substantially original compositions. And my wife, Hope, said to me, people keep asking you for an album of Beatles, and I know you don't want to do it, but please, can you do it for me? So I said, well, okay, I'll do it, but you have to produce it. So she, kind of took the responsibility for making it happen. and as she has done, with the subsequent ones and other albums too. But it was kind of her prompting that pushed me in that direction, which actually ended up being, quite productive. I'm a huge fan of great songwriting, from whatever era it is. But the Beatles are so kind of transcendent of their particular era, but also just in general. I mean, there are some of the greatest songs ever written in the Beatle repertoire. So, and there's so many of them too, that it's kind of a natural. It just ended up being a natural thing because solo guitar and the way that I approach doing that stuff as a musician, really, it's a nexus that seems to work.
Well, you brought up kind of composing and writing, and I want to ask you kind of my first proper question. Aside from, doing records, you've had a long, successful career doing composing for TV and movies. However, within the last decade or so, you've been working on composing for video games, like StarCraft and Diablo. I want to ask...
mostly Diablo, because that was a big project, Diablo 3. And I got the gig because I knew the head of music for Blizzard, and they wanted a guitar player that could transition from the previous version of the game, which was guitar driven, but they wanted to go more orchestral with it too. And I kind of can occupy that middle ground. So that was how that came about. And then within that, in terms of working for Blizzard, I did a lot of studio work for them, playing on like World of Warcraft and stuff.
Well, I noticed that looking at that, all the games you've done were all Blizzard
there's
games.
Other ones that I couldn't even tell you what they're called. I mean, but that was kind of a focused compositional thing. I don't really have much. I don't really discriminate much between different modes of composing. The act of composition is just, you slant it towards whether it's for a picture or whether it's for a game or whether it's for the stage. It's all just putting musical elements together in a way that's entertaining and dynamic and suits the context.
So you don't really approach it any differently than you would, say, a TV project or a film project?
With video game, the video game work that I did, there was a much longer time frame. Whereas with television, it's like, okay, here's the picture, we're dubbing in 10 days, and you have an hour's worth of orchestral music to write. And it's like, that's a whole different thing. Mm-hmm. You don't get much sleep under those circumstances. But in reality, my focus has always been being a guitar player. And because I'm a musician who plays guitar, applying that musicianship to whatever the compositional task is has been just a very natural thing for me to do, and nothing that I originally had the ambition to do. I always wanted to be a studio musician. That was my goal.
Well, you brought up studio musicians, and you brought up the guitar, which leads me to a question I want to ask you. Who are some of your major early influences that made you want to be a guitar player?
Well, I got my first guitar almost exactly, 58 years ago, for my 11th birthday. No, 57 years ago, for my 11th birthday. And that was the week where Beatlemania really kind of crested in England, where everybody became aware of what Beatlemania was. And I had been nagging my parents for a guitar for about a year, but didn't get anywhere. And then, but I think that because the Beatles kind of all of a sudden made it very legit, that they, my dad wanted me to play the saxophone, so I had volunteered to play clarinet in school, and I put my name on the list to get a clarinet, but I made sure it was at the bottom. So they ran out long before they got to me. And so the guitar was kind of like, that was my focus. I think it could have easily have been the piano if I'd started a few years earlier. But the guitar was so present there was a lot of twang on the radio.
Oh yeah.
And most notably the Shadows.
I was going to mention, if you picked up the guitar as a kid in the early to mid 60s, the influence, even though we're talking about the Beatles, I think the main influence would be Hank Marvin of the Shadows.
Yeah, Hank was an important sound because the Shadows had been having hit records for a few years. I think Apache was like 1959. And they had a string of top 10 hits, as well as backing Cliff Richard, who was kind of England's Elvis at the time. And so they were very present. You could turn on the TV and see them and see Hank Marvin with his red Stratocaster and stuff. And that was very cool. But 1963, there was a lot of music going on. What became in America known as the British invasion was really kind of marshalling its forces at that particular point in time. And so I was hearing a lot of English pop, not quite rock, because rock hadn't really kind of identified itself as a different genre.
It was all pop until about maybe 67.
Yeah, 66, when the blues, when the blues influence really started to take off. I mean, the Stones were bringing blues into it right from the get-go, but they were still, with Brian Jones' influence, they were still making, what were essentially commercial pop records. So that was kind of the sound. But I was also, we had Radio Luxembourg, which was broadcast from Luxembourg in Europe, and that wasn't bound by the playlist restrictions that the BBC had. The BBC had rules about what they called needle time, in the days when records were played on turntables with needles.
And that's why they had to do a lot of live sessions.
There was a lot of live sessions, and I played a lot of live sessions when I started getting into studio work.
It's like you read my mind, though.
You get all the Beatles stuff and Zeppelin, and all the some of the coolest stuff I heard on the radio were BBC sessions. I mean, I remember some of the early Cream stuff, and the Beatles in particular, because you could hear them on tune in on a Saturday morning, and there's Beatles doing stuff that wasn't on the albums. The first time I heard Johnny B. Good was the Beatles doing it on the BBC.
Really?
Yeah. But I think that the first important influence for me, I took a few group lessons when I first started, but my dad took me over to see a guitar player friend of his who showed me some chords. And it was like, it showed me an F major 7 chord, and it was like the most gorgeous thing I'd ever heard. And then he showed me a C13th, and it was like, wow, there's this universe that the guitar can kind of exist in, as well as all the rock and the pop stuff. And then there was also, at the same time, folk music was pop music in 63, because you get the early, you get early Dylan, you got Joan Baez, you've got Judy Collins, you've got artists that are having Peter, Paul and Mary having hit records with folk songs. And so I was always, even then, I was intrigued by the self-sufficiency of the folk singers. The fact that Bob Dylan could get up there with just an acoustic guitar and a harmonica, and it was like that always stuck with me, and still does, because, part of the philosophy behind what I do as a guitar soloist is based on that notion of self-sufficiency. The fact that I can make a complete musical statement with one guitar.
I read somewhere, you can correct me if it's not true, as it tends to happen on the internet. One of your big early influences, and it's a guitar player I really admire because I dig a lot of his stuff, Jeff Beck.
Oh yeah, I mean that whole crew of English guitar players, whether Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and of course Jimi Hendrix, came to London to launch his career. The psychologists say that what you listen to in your 15th year especially right around 14 and a half, is like the key moment. That's the stuff that imprints on your brain, which takes you to, basically like May, June 1967. So, what I was like thoroughly imprinted with was Sergeant Pepper, Are You Experienced, Pink Floyd, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. That whole year there was just an amazing amount of progressive rock music. That was really the very beginning of a kind of a prog rock sensibility.
Well, I can't imagine a better year to have your big formative influences in than 67.
Well, 66 could have been quite
okay.
cool.
Well, there's a contender there, and maybe 68 too.
That period when I was, 14, 15 years old, and I'd been playing a couple of years, and I was getting into playing electric guitar and blues, especially like 66. You have the John Mayall Blues Breakers album with Eric Clapton. I wore that album out. At 16 RPM, figuring out what Eric was playing. I mean, it was, that was just what I did. But at the same time, I was also listening to Django Reinhardt. Or I had been doing some gigs with a local band leader who was a trumpet player, and he gave me an album by two LA studio jazz players, the Candoli brothers, that had Howard Roberts on guitar. So I was hearing this very bluesy jazz guitar, and another one slowing it down and trying to figure out what he was playing. And then I discovered like Barney Kessel and Joe Pass, but also on the other side of the spectrum, Bert Jansch and John Remborn, Pentangle were quite popular at that time. Fairport Convention, I used to see Fairport Convention about once a week. When, before they became kind of jigs and reels, and they were still, and Richard Thompson was doing 20-minute improvisations on a Les Paul Gold Top, and it was, it was just that was a big part of my inspiration. But also, ragtime, like Stefan Grossman, I loved that stuff. And as I went on in my teens, and I was playing classical guitar and also figuring out ragtime tunes, figuring out Scott Joplin tunes and stuff. It just kind of, on one hand, I'm on this career track to be a studio player, but I'm also, on the other hand, just obsessed with what you can do with a solo guitar.
You just want to figure out everything that you possibly can.
Well, yeah, I mean, that, especially when you have the time to do it. But I was studying music. I was studying music history, music theory, because I knew that I wanted to be a professional musician. And, both of my parents left school at a very early age and didn't have the benefit of, even a high school education. So I felt that I owed it to them to get the best education I could get, but it had to be, for me, in the area of making music and understanding music. So I ended up going to London University. I wasn't intending to originally. There was one place in England that you could study guitar in a way that would lead to studio work, which was in Leeds, which is, a long way north of London. And I got accepted at the college there, but when I got my A-level results, I had actually done much better in music than my teachers ever imagined I would. And I decided that because I was already gigging and had spent my teenage years essentially paying my dues around London, it seemed a bit pointless to leave London right at the point where I was starting to kind of really, get a network going. So I took a year off. I took a gap year, which then later became kind of a common thing to do, but I was kind of a pioneer of the gap year. Was busy gigging and playing in jazz bands and doing all kinds of stuff, whatever, just all kinds of music making. And then I got accepted at London University and went there and studied for a music degree for 3 years. Because in England, you essentially do one subject and you do it for 3 years and that's it, as opposed to 4 years with more general education. In England, at that time at least, they pretty much figured that they'd filled your brain up with enough general education by 16 that you could start to specialize after that. So it's a little different in the States. So.
I want to ask, when you were studying in London, what pointed you towards the lute?
Oh, just because it was a fretted instrument that you played fingerstyle, and because the guitar players like Bert Jansch or John Renbourn in particular, who were playing transcriptions of lute music, just really fascinated me. And I used to go to lute concerts. In fact, I went to a concert. The greatest lute player at that time, maybe still, was a man named Paul Odette, who could it's just an incredible, when you hear the lute played authentically, it's an incredible sound. And I thought that was really cool. And it was also kind of a hip thing to do, when you're in college and you have professors who are like world's experts on early music, playing the lute kind of gets you extra credit. And it was not a big step from classical guitar to playing lute at all. But I didn't really stick with it. I mean, I still, once in a blue moon, I'll do something on lute, but it takes too long to tune it more than anything else. So, it takes long enough to tune 6 strings without having to deal with 19 or however many.
Oh, I can't even imagine. I get frustrated enough having to tune the 12 string every now and again.
Yeah. 12 strings can be pretty tricky, but what can you do? It's changing strings on a 12 string, especially a Rickenbacker 12 string.
Well, those Rickenbacker 12
strings. I'll pay somebody to do that. I'll pay my tech to do that, because that's the hardest guitar to change strings on.
Well, because they've got the weird headstock with the slots and the tuners all facing different directions.
But it's also because the way the string attaches underneath the tailpiece, you have to keep the tension on, otherwise it falls out. So you got the tension on, you're trying to poke it through, one or other of these machine head, things, and it's horrible.
Yeah,
I won't do it.
I
just draw the line at, and changing the strings on a Rickenbacker 12 is one of them.
Well, I find myself, as I'm talking to more and more musicians, I've always had this dream of owning a Rickenbacker, and I find myself being pushed further and further away from that dream.
Well, it's only the 12 string that's really the issue with that, because of the way that they configured it. But, Rickenbackers are cool guitars. They are not their pickups aren't particularly powerful.
No.
So they're not terribly versatile, but if you want to do the John Lennon rhythm thing,
yeah.
or the George, or Rickenbacker 12 string, Roger McGuinn, that kind of sound, but also at least I have a 65 Rickenbacker 12 string, and the neck is really quite narrow. In fact, I think George Harrison commented on it later in his life, that he just couldn't figure out how he ever managed to play it when he was in the Beatles, because it's just, the strings are really close together.
I played a similar model, and I was surprised at how narrow the neck was, because I know they're making some nowadays that have wider necks,
right,
where you can actually, play chords and not have to look at your hand like, what the hell am I doing?
Yeah. Well, you want to think about this in terms of Beatle guitars. The Hofner bass has no dots on the side.
They don't.
And you watch Paul in concert, and before every tune, he tilts his bass so that he can see the fingerboard and then locates where he's going to start. And then he doesn't look at it because he knows where he is. But there's no, you don't get, it's like on a classical guitar, you don't get that extra little guide.
Now I'm embarrassed. I've owned a Hofner bass for about 8 years, and I haven't noticed that yet.
Well, maybe some of them do have the dots, but the original ones didn't.
Again,
Paul still plays his old one. So
you're teaching me all these new things. This is becoming really informative. So you've mentioned that you kind of knew from quite early on that you wanted to work as a session musician.
Right.
I want to ask you about your first session, and do you have any memories about, going into the studio for the first time as a session guy?
I don't really remember the specifics of my very first session because there were a number of sessions that just kind of blended into each other. I think that what I do distinctly remember when it really kind of got up to a higher level was one of I think the first album project that I worked on was for Cleo Lane, who is an English jazz singer, married to John Dankworth, who was a great alto sax player. In fact, I had done some work with him when I was in the National Youth Jazz Orchestra, because he was a big band arranger, and we used to play some of his arrangements. But I got called in to work on this album, and the producer was George Martin. So, almost immediately getting into that level of studio work, I'm working with George Martin. So, and I was pretty green at that time. I mean, it was like, I remember we were doing something in the key of B, and I felt that it was like, you didn't use a capo because it was not manly, in some kind of fashion. But B major is a bit of a struggle. I mean, over the years I've kind of learned how to tame it, but at that point it was like, there's some pretty hefty bar chords, and but I learned a lot from the way George Martin kind of coaxed me through it, that a producer, a good producer, really knew how to get the best out of a musician. And so that was a valuable lesson and a memorable session. Beyond that, I mean, there were so many. I remember there was one I played on a demo, and I don't even have any idea who it was for, but I remember Mickey Waller was the drummer who had played with Rod Stewart, I think. And I was baffled when he showed up, and I was used to drummers kind of showing up with drums in cases, and his drums were just loose. And the producer was a man named Andy Bowen, who was, I think, a bass player, and I think he played with a band called The Herd.
Oh, that was Peter Frampton's band, wasn't it?
Right, and I think he was a bass player in The Herd. I can look it up, but I won't right now. Yeah. But I remember he was the one who showed me how to play chips, where you do like you do an upstroke on just the top three notes, and that's kind of, that goes with the snare drum on a lot, especially 50s style stuff. Bop, chip, da, 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 and he was the one who showed me how to do that. So there's little kind of snippets of things, but I got busy fairly quickly with all of this, so it was not, everything kind of blends together. I mean, I covered some of this in I did a book, Guitar with Wings, some years ago, where I talked about the Back to the Egg sessions with Wings and illustrated with the photos that I took. But I also predicated it with my story and how I got into Wings and being a studio musician and all that kind of stuff. So there's some things in there. I'd have to reread it to remember what I've forgotten since I wrote it.
Well, I'm going to be quite obvious here. If any of you out there do not have his book, go find it. You are doing yourself a disservice.
You can get it through my website. I have an online store. That way you get it signed. If you buy it from Amazon, it's more expensive and you don't get a signature. So
even better. I mean, who doesn't want a Laurence Juber signature?
Well, there you go.
So within a couple years of your first session, you wound up on the soundtrack doing the James Bond theme on The Spy Who Loved Me.
Mm-hmm.
So was that a little nerve-wracking?
Actually, when you're in a studio with musicians that you work with on a regular basis, for me it's not typically nerve-wracking, because the goal is you're there as a professional. So there's sometimes there's a bit of a kind of a flutter that comes from working with somebody that is a name artist, or in that case it was Marvin Hamlish was the composer on that, and he was somewhat legendary. And at one point I showed up for a session that was just me. The very beginning of the movie, that you just hear the Bond theme, the guitar lick on a solo guitar, and I showed up at the session, And Marvin Hamley said, "Oh, I'm hungry. I need to get a snack before we do the session. Come with me." So I went with him to a restaurant, and we're sitting there talking. And his snack was like a full steak dinner. It was crazy. And then, just being in, especially that was at CTS Studios in Wembley in the big room, which is a very big control room, and you're watching the picture on a movie screen, on a big sound stage. It's kind of, there's something imposing. There's a lot of gravitas to that. And movie sessions in general have a certain kind of gravitas, mostly because there's a lot of money being spent. There are time constraints. And, one could be at Warner Brothers, for example, where it's a huge studio, and the guitar typically is in like an isolation booth in the corner, and another guitar way over the other side. And you can't talk to each other unless you have headphones on. You can't hear what's going on without the headphones. And there's a lot of pressure. That can be nerve-wracking because just, the kind of pressure on getting it right, not making a mistake, reading the part correctly, and not having a lot of time to look it over, and you can't really afford to make mistakes. In the early days when I first started doing movie stuff in LA, and TV stuff in particular, they were still working on film. They weren't working on videotape. So there's a guy in a machine room racking up the film so that the conductor can see the picture. Yeah. To match the cues. And if anybody makes a mistake, the film has to be re-racked, the multi-track recorder has to be rewound. And now it's just, you hit a button on Pro Tools, or, and it's all digital and integrated. But in those days, the technology was still, it was effective and it sounded great, but it was also quite clunky.
Well, I can only imagine that kind of would have added to, if you had any nerves, having to play exactly in time with the film as it's going along.
Well, that's really the conductor's job. You get a click, in the headphones, you typically get a click.
Okay.
And so you're playing with the click, but the conductor, there may be places where you may be doing something without a click, and then you're really following the conductor. And the conductor has to make sure that the cutoffs are in the right place, and the dynamics are right. You can see a part, but you've got to make sure that you're not playing pianissimo when you're supposed to be playing fortissimo or whatever. There's a lot of information to process. And it's a very, very focused kind of thing, and it's not easy. And the rewards can be quite good, but it is a lot of pressure, and it's also very competitive. When I got to LA in 1981, it was already really too late to catch the kind of the post-Wrecking Crew wave. Yeah. But I found my niche and ended up playing on a lot of TV shows and a lot of movie stuff. Not so much movies, more records and TV, but some movies like Pocahontas and Good Will Hunting, and that was kind of cool, being in the studio with Danny Elfman.
Wow.
And I did a few things. I did Men in Black 2 with him, and a couple of other movies.
And this will probably be before we kind of move on to another thing. I want to ask you about another session thing you did, and it was only last year or a year or two ago. You played on a cut on the new Harry Styles album.
Well, that's because of my daughter Ilse.
Oh, she co-wrote the song.
Yeah, Ilse co-wrote the song, and she, that's what she does. She's a songwriter. In fact, she co-wrote Miley's latest Midnight Sky, which just got mashed up with Stevie Nicks. And that's actually a very cool record. And, she's worked with Mark Ronson. She's worked with, are you familiar with Leaky Lee?
Yes.
Yeah, she co-wrote most of Leaky Lee's last album.
Wow.
And has been working with all kinds of interesting people over the years. But I just, she called me up one day and said, "What are you doing this afternoon?" And I said, "What do you need?" And I said, "Well, they could use some guitar on this track." So I, went over to where it was East West, which is what used to be in Hollywood, what used to be part of the United Western studio complex. So a lot of amazing records were recorded in that studio, including Pet Sounds.
Really?
Yeah. And, and I worked with Jeff Basker, who was producing and who co-wrote with Harry Styles and Elsie, and they wanted, kind of this kind of cool guitar part that I obliged them with. I know Harry Styles is a big Wings fan and a big fan of Back to the Egg in particular, but I think it was really kind of just purely coincidental that it also happened to be my daughter that wrote the tune, so, yeah.
Well, you mentioned Wings. I think I should probably ask you that,
Okay.
So how did you first meet then former Beatle and future future Visa spokesperson Paul McCartney?
What was that last bit?
Former Beatle and future Visa spokesperson.
Oh, he's a Visa spokesperson, is he?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, he did stuff. I thought it was funny.
The first time I met him was very, very inauspicious. I was doing a session also at CTS Studios where we had done the James Bond thing, and I think it was a advertising jingle or something. And I was working with Herbie Flowers, who's a great English studio bass player, and the drummer was Tony Newman. And actually, the two of them played on a lot of the T-Rex stuff. But Herbie's really kind of one of the great English studio players, and we were on our musicians union break and went to the restroom, and there's Paul McCartney zipping up his fly. So not the most auspicious way to meet a Beatle, but Herbie introduced me, and that was it. I mean, it was very brief. Paul was there. Wings were working on mixing the stuff for the Wings Over America project.
So this would have been 76?
That for the movie. So this would have been sometime in 1977.
Okay.
But then in August of 77, I was at a transcendental meditation retreat with Mike McCartney, Paul's brother.
Mike McGear
from the Scaffold. And one morning in August, he walks in brandishing a newspaper declaring that Elvis had died. So I learned that Elvis had died from Paul McCartney's brother, which was kind of an interesting thing. But things were kind of like I was getting encircled by this, because shortly thereafter I was playing lead guitar on a TV show with David Essex, who was a big pop star at the time. And Denny Lane was a guest, and we did Go Now, and Denny liked my playing and eventually recommended me to Paul. And a few months after that, I had run into them at Air Studios in London, which is another one of those great studios that doesn't exist anymore. But
that was George Martin's studio.
It was George Martin's, yeah, because Air was the Association of Independent Record Producers. Yeah. I was early for a session, and they were in the room running late, so they invited me in. And Denny had, Denny and I bonded a little bit more, and I got introduced to Paul and Linda, and I knew they were looking for somebody, but I was, I didn't imagine that I would be kind of on the list. But Denny recommended me, and some months later, it wasn't until April of 78 that I was working at Abbey Road in Studio 2.
Never heard of it.
No. Well, it's just a street in northwest London.
Yeah.
But I was in Studio 2, and there's that staircase that goes up to the control room, and you didn't go up there. If you were a studio player, typically you didn't go up there. And I had done many sessions there, including the Alan Parsons Project, and I didn't know it was the Alan Parsons Project because I didn't get up to the control room to see who was running the board. Typically under those circumstances, I was my relationship was with the arranger or the conductor or whoever. There was a phone call for me at Abbey Road, and this was April of 78, and it was from McCartney's office saying, Denny wants to know if you can come and jam on Monday, and oh, by the way, Paul and Linda will be there. So immediately it became apparent that this was actually a Wings audition. So I called up my brother and borrowed some LPs because I didn't have any Wings stuff. And I was familiar with the radio hits, but I didn't really know the album stuff. But then I realized that there was just no way I was going to be able to anticipate what we were going to do. And as it turned out, me and Steve Holly were both auditioning, and we played, a bunch of reggae grooves and some Chuck Berry tunes and got offered the gig. So I think we both fit the suit,
Well, and the rest is history.
Yeah, ancient history at this point.
Oh, it's not ancient. Kids like me are still talking about it.
I suppose so, yeah.
Well, I want to talk to you about the album you played on, Back to the Egg. I'm sure you've been asked, infinite questions about that album. I want to ask about one song in particular, which is my favorite cut on the album, Spin It On.
Uh-huh.
Do you have any memories from that session?
Oh, yeah, very much. It's funny because the first session that Wings did was not for Back to the Egg. We did a demo of a song called Same Time Next Year.
Okay.
And it was a big ballad, like a My Love type ballad. And, after we did the tracking session, they put like a 60-piece string orchestra on it. And it was, it was the most produced demo I'd ever worked on. But then we went up to Scotland and spent some time jamming. And then we went back up to Scotland to start recording. And the first tune we did was To You, which is pretty out there.
Yeah.
And then the second tune we did was Spin It On, which is this punk rockabilly kind of, and both of those tunes are like a million miles away from a big My Love type romantic ballad. So it was like, okay, this is going to be an unpredictable gig. And after we had cut the track, Paul said, okay, these are the spots I want a guitar solo. So I sat in the control room right next to him and just, eyeball to eyeball, just played licks, in these spots. And he kind of directed me a little bit, but it was really kind of a synergy to get what was appropriate to the track, in a very short time. I mean, it wasn't like we spent all night doing it. It just kind of flowed. And that was a lesson in terms of what he could bring out of me that I wouldn't necessarily have predicted that you could get out of me. So it was a productive, certainly a productive session.
Oh, I want to actually ask, what guitar were you playing in that session? What was your axe of choice?
That was a 63 Strat with, I think I had Mighty Mite pickups on it.
Really?
Because the original pickups were not in great shape. Mm-hmm. For whatever reason. And that was that era when everybody was really getting into replacement pickups. So Seymour Duncan was winding pickups, and there was Mighty Mite, and there was DiMarzio, and for some reason, I think Mighty Mite might have even been the first ones. But in any case, for some reason, I had those pickups on that guitar, and I think the amp that I was using was a Mesa Boogie Mark I, I think, for that one.
I mean, I'm just a sucker for the golden era of slabboard Strats.
Yeah, that actually that guitar ended up getting refinished, and then I traded it for the Rickenbacker 12-string, which probably in the long run wasn't the best deal financially, but it wasn't my favorite. The 65 Strats are the ones with the wider fingerboard. And actually, the Strat that I most use now, I have a 57, which is the one that's in the Wonderful Christmas Time video.
I am so jealous of you right now.
What's that?
I am so jealous of you right now. You have a 57 Strat.
I have a 57.
It has that beautiful boat neck, the V.
Yeah, exactly, the boat neck. But I have a Schecter, a 1980 Schecter, which was in kind of original Schecter. When they were being made in Van Nuys near here. And that is a it's a imbuya body with a Palfero neck. And it's an amazing guitar. It's heavy, but it's amazing. And I use that for a lot of studio work along with the 57. I use both of those in the 80s for a lot of stuff, 80s and 90s. And then that just kind of sat in a corner collecting dust for a while. And earlier this year, I put in some pickups and wired it and changed the hardware out. And it's now my kind of number one guitar. And it plays just like that, you know, like a 63. It's got that, it has that that kind of vibe to it. And it's a killer sounding instrument. So, yeah, I mean, you know, I was, at that time, especially, I was really kind of looking for the perfect guitar sound, which, of course, is, you know, essentially unattainable. But that was the period, you know, I got, during the Back to the Egg sessions, I got a 335, which is the one in the Good Night Tonight video that's on some of the tracks on Back to the Egg. But I also had an early 70s, was it early? No, it must have been later than that. It must have been about 74 Strat that was actually quite useful. And that's the one that I used on Again and Again and Again. But I also had a Les Paul Custom and, you know, a bunch of guitars. Well, and the first time I went to New York, I went to Manny's and bought more, and then took them back to England and sold them and bought more. You know, it's just like, because they were cheaper in New York than they were in London, so I could make some money.
Oh, don't even get me started. Even now, guitars are so much cheaper. Not even in New York, just in the States in general. I live in Canada, and so right. I will admit I have gone down a few times, picked up a guitar down there, and just kind of maybe driven back across the border. Maybe didn't say what I had.
Yeah. That happens.
Yeah.
But, you know, crossing that border with a guitar, I mean, my experience is always, you know, going into Canada, it's always, okay, you know, work permit. Well, I don't need a work permit. We'll go stand in line over there anyway, you know, and then they'll say, well, you know, an hour later, but you don't need a work permit. And then going through customs with merchandise and, like, you can only bring in so much and, you know, there's all kinds of restrictions there. But my favorite one is I had a gig somewhere, it was right like across the border, and I forget where it was, but there are the two customs posts that are in New York State that are like, you know, there's the one kind of on the east side and there's the one on the west side. Yeah. And I went up on the east side and came back on the west side because for some reason I was going to Nazareth to meet up with a friend of mine from Martin Guitars, and coming back at 6 o'clock in the morning, there's this one guy in the customs house, and I'm there with my car, and my guitar's sitting on the back seat, and he's looking at my passport, and he's looking at my guitar, and I'm starting to think, now I'm going to have to, you know, explain. And then he says, so you're going to be playing with Paul in Ottawa? Turned out he was like a Wings fan.
Oh.
That's happened a few times. So, you know, phew.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, I've always had issues just in general with authority figures at airports that really dates back to, you know, January of 1980.
Well,
and Paul got it, you know.
Well, I was going to ask a question about that because I was reading this Philip Norman book about Paul, and he said you were on the same plane.
Yeah, I was standing next to him.
Yeah. And you got pulled into different questioning areas, and the Japanese authorities were interested in your Les Paul, thinking you were going to smuggle pot in through...
Yeah, I just bought a Les Paul, a 57 Gold Top on 48th Street, back in the day when there were guitar stores on 48th Street, because there's nothing like it was then. Now it's all changed. Yeah. No more Manny's or any of that. So I was hand carrying it. All the rest of the gear had been, you know, shipped, but I was hand carrying this guitar, and Paul got taken off to a separate room, and I and Linda and the kids were waiting in another area, and then they took me into a room and pointed to the guitar and handed me a screwdriver, and I had to unscrew the plastic panels on the back and the truss rod cover just to show that there was nothing stashed in there.
You couldn't stash much pot in a Les Paul truss
Hey,
rod.
but you never know. You know, it's like they're just doing their job. You know.
Yeah.
So, and that didn't bother me because my pockets had been vacuumed, and everything was.
Yeah.
I was as clean as a whistle.
Well, you got off a bit easier than Paul.
Just a bit.
Yeah. My friend isn't as, versed in the world of Wings and Paul McCartney, but when I told him who I'd be talking to, and I said he was a member of Wings from 78 to, the end of Wings, he said, "Oh, you gotta ask him. Please, for me, Ethan, ask him about that day." So how did the rest of your day go that day in January?
I went to the hotel with Linda and the kids, and wherever you looked, there were posters for the Wings tour. And we were kind of hopeful that it would blow over one way or another. We got to the hotel, got checked in. It was on the news, and it was not looking good. So, then it was basically, okay, eat some sushi, be in Tokyo, but not know what's going to happen next. And then the next morning, all the posters had gone. There was like no sign of it. And
see, just hearing that, if someone had grabbed one of those posters, it'd probably be worth a fortune now.
Well, none of the fans sent their tickets back for a refund.
Really?
They all kept their tickets. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to have to check eBay after this. For a ticket that...
I do have the tour jacket.
You have the tour jacket?
I have the Japanese tour jacket. Yeah.
Well, one of I'm a record collector, and I really like bootlegs. And there's a particular bootleg...
My vinyl over there.
I'm starting to feel like we're kindred spirits. There's a bootleg called, I think it's Wings Live in Japan, which
of course it wasn't.
Yeah, but it was the tour book cover, and on the back
Right.
It was Paul in handcuffs, and it was a different live gig altogether. But I have to admit, it's one of the funniest bootleg covers I'd seen.
Oh yeah, I've got a whole booklet of all the press clippings and everything from that particular misadventure.
Yeah.
But you know what's amazing? I mean, Paul's in jail for 10 days. He goes back to England. Within the week, he's back in the studio.
Really?
Yeah, he's back in the studio mixing the live set from the second Glasgow concert that is bootlegged as Last Flight. Well, because there was need for a single, and I think the plan, what became the plan was to put out Coming Up as the first single from McCartney 2 with the live version on the B-side. And that kind of backfired because, he did this wonderful video where he's, playing all these different roles, and then they debuted it on Saturday Night Live, and radio stations were not going on it until the DJs flipped over the disc and said, wait a minute, that's the Paul McCartney that we want to play. And it went to number one.
Yeah, the live version with you guys.
Yep.
Which is, I'll say it, it's better.
It's different and more representative of where the band was going in terms of being a rock band. With this kind of dance groove. I mean, it's funny, the last two Wings hits were both essentially dance records, Good Night Tonight and Coming Up. But, Paul had made this detour into this kind of proto-electronica that the McCartney 2 album represents, and then started heading in this pop direction. But meanwhile, he had a rock band.
Yeah.
And, so we started working on the Tug of War material but we were doing it in a rehearsal room, and we really couldn't get into the granular detail of it without being in the studio. But when George Martin got involved and the decision was made that it wasn't going to be a Wings album, we never actually got the chance to do that kind of massage the tunes as a band album. And at that point, I saw the writing on the wall, and I was making plans to move to New York.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna ask, what was the atmosphere amongst you wingmen in 1980 when you didn't have an album coming out and the future?
We just stayed busy. Well, I stayed busy. Denny was working on his own stuff. He put a band together and was gigging.
And you played on his album.
I was doing some session work. I was starting to get into writing. I did a little bit of commercial composing. I did my first jingle. In fact, I think maybe the only jingle.
That was convenient timing. You say jingle and you hear jingles.
Yeah, my ring was making noise.
It's somehow appropriate for this Christmas episode.
There you go. The first jingle I and only jingle I did was for a chicken Paxo chicken stuffing, which was, and it was an animated. It was like their motto was the Rooster Booster, and I did like a little red rooster kind of groove thing that they had an animation, and my friend Tony Kaye, who's a director, who was a famous animation director, and then went on to direct a movie called American History X. He was the one who hired me to do it, and that was kind of an interesting experience, and it kind of like opened the door for me to the notion that once I got to LA and I started getting the opportunity to do some composing, that was something that I could actually handle, So I put together a small studio. I always had, even with Wings, I had like a little 4-track studio, and then it just gradually kind of grew from 4 to 8 to 16 to 24, and then to Pro Tools. And then, I did a lot of session work, and then I produced 4 albums for Al Stewart.
Well, I want to touch on that in a second. Actually, I'll say it now.
All right.
In the Christmas generosity spirit and all this, whatever it is, I want to ask you a question, because my dear friend Richard, my best friend, is a massive fan of Al Stewart. And so I want to ask you, how did you get involved with Al Stewart?
That came about because there's a man named James Jensen who approached me about putting out records. I'd already put out a couple of albums. Actually, I put out an album, and he became something of a fan of it and wanted to get involved somehow. And he co-produced my second and third albums. And he said he wanted to have his own record label. And I said, well, if you get a catalog, I'll, certainly I could be on your label. So he actually ended up distributing a German guitar catalog, and there was kind of a reciprocal thing that happened with my record then got released in Germany. So it was a reasonable piece of business. But James was also a journalist and had interviewed Al Stewart, and in the process of interviewing him, discovered that Peter White was going off to have a solo career, and Al was looking for a guitar player. So I said, well, I've always been a fan of Al's. I actually opened for him when I was about 14 in London at a folk club.
Really? Back in the 60s?
Yeah, this would have been, well, actually, no, it would have been more than 14. It was like Bedsitter Images.
Okay, so 60 something.
So James took me over to meet Al, and we hit it off, and then I did a short tour with him in Colorado. And then he came over and had this song Night Train to Munich, and we did a demo of it here in the studio, and next thing I knew that there was an album to make, and they wanted me to produce it. So, and then so the Between the Wars album is actually, I'm kind of featured with him. The 3 subsequent ones were just Al records, but Between the Wars was kind of based around the idea of 2 guitars, and then we did a reasonable amount of touring.
Because it's credited as Al Stewart and Laurence Juber.
Yeah. So yeah, that was. But the other ones, were done, had a different kind of approach to them, because they were more Al coming in and with songs that were keyboard songs or whatever. And so my role was not only as a guitar player, but also as an arranger and producer. But Between the Wars had a kind of a special vibe to it. That's one of my favorites. One of my favorite albums that I've worked on.
Well, there's always a staple on this show, because we're getting close to the end. I want to ask you some.
Very near the end.
Well, yeah. Getting very near the end. Yeah. You made the Beatle pun before I did, and I have egg on my face. I call these quickfire questions. So I want to ask you, what is your favorite Beatles song?
Whew. I told you not to ask me what my favorite questions are. I can't even answer it. It's just there's too many to really kind of. I know in terms of playing, one of my favorites I think is Strawberry Fields.
Really?
While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I love playing Strawberry Fields as a solo guitar arrangement, but it's an impossible question, because there's it's like, which era of Beatles?
Yeah.
Because She Loves You is so radically different from Why Don't We Do It in the Road?
Yeah. Thank You, Girl, and then Tomorrow Never Knows.
Exactly, yeah. But within the space of like 3-4 years, I mean, the transition, She Loves You was August of 1963. By that time, whenever it was, they started on Revolver. It's 3 years.
Yeah.
Go from She Loves You to Tomorrow Never Knows. And Dr. Robert and all of that. Yeah. Yeah, but impossible question to answer.
Yeah. Well, it's also an impossible question to ask, because again, they made a lot of good music. So you talked a lot about the being immersed, or the music that really kind of influenced you at a young age, the 66, 67, 68. I want to ask you, is there any particular album that means a lot to you that you still go back to from that time?
Yeah, the blues, John Mayall Blues Breakers with Clapton. Because I think that's kind of, that moment in Clapton's career is a very, very fruitful one.
Have you treated yourself to a new copy of the album since you wore the first one out?
Yeah, well, I have it on CD. I have it autographed by John Mayall. Because John, my wife Hope, for a period in the late 80s and early 90s, had a comedy rock and roll band called the Housewives with Maggie Mayall, who was married to John at the time. And so John used to come out and do gigs with us, which would be fun, get him up and play, do a little 12-bar jam with him on harmonica. I've got video of that somewhere.
Oh, man. Oh, you have made me sufficiently jealous today. But yeah, I just want to thank you for the bottom of my heart for coming on the show today, and to help this merry season, because we are totally not recording in November. See, this is what...
No, you can find... I have 2 Christmas albums. I have Winter Guitar, which is strictly solo guitar, which was done, I think, 97 or 98. 97, I think. And then a few years ago, I did an ensemble one, a trio one called Holidays and Holy Nights. And both of those are on, all the streaming services. So whether it's, Spotify or...
Apple Music and...
Apple Music, all of that.
Yeah. All those wonderful things.
Well, I'm not so sure about the wonderful.
I say it because you can find it
It's-
easier.
Yeah. It's certainly a lot easier to access music. The problem is that, I mean, even a CD, I mean, I would typically sell a CD for $20 American. But based on 1963 prices, an album should actually cost $35.
Really?
So, oh yeah.
How much did an album cost in the 60s?
I bought with the Beatles, cost me 32 shillings and sixpence.
Okay.
And if you actually figure that out, it works out, in converting and allowing for the passage of time and inflation, it works out about $35.
Well, I've had that happen before, where I've been talking with some people about buying records in the UK in the 60s and said, oh, 2 and 6 or 36, and I can't figure out how that's an episode for another day, how it actually worked, because I can't get my head around it.
240 pennies to the pound. A shilling was 12 pennies.
You're blowing my
And 20
mind.
shillings was a pound. And so like 12 and sixpence was 12 shillings and sixpence. And then, but what made it even more complicated was there was something called a guinea, which was 21 shillings. And like electronic equipment, like hi-fi equipment, was always priced in guineas.
That sounds way more complicated than it should be.
Overnight, and they went decimal, and the price of everything doubled. So what was one old penny became one new penny, which was 2.4 old pennies. So one's spending money didn't go quite as far. And then we had, we got ridiculous rates of value-added tax in the 70s, where a set of electric guitar strings had a 25% value-added tax, but a set of acoustic guitar strings had a lower rate because it wasn't electric.
Okay.
Because anything electronic had a higher rate of VAT. So, yeah, I mean, it's crazy.
But there's nothing electric about the strings.
England in the 70s was a crazy place to live. So,
yeah. Well, I'll bring this to a close, and I'll ask you: is there anything else that you want to make sure our audience knows, like where to find you, what else you've done?
You can find me at laurencejuber.com. Currently, you can find me on my Facebook artist page on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 1:30 Pacific time, doing mini concerts, what I call Tea Time with LJ. And other than that, I'm not touring at this point. I don't know when I'll be touring again. So doing Facebook Live is at least an opportunity for me to play in front of a virtual audience. And beyond that, you can find me online and find me in the streaming services.
Well,
I actually have a Twitch account now, and I've been thinking about doing some workshops on Twitch.
that would actually be really cool, doing stuff on Twitch.
Yeah, I have a friend who does 3 concerts a week, one on Facebook, one on YouTube, and one on Twitch, and the same audience follows him from one to the next.
Well, there you go. Your Tea Time audience can follow you over to
Maybe
Twitch.
We'll see. I mean, Facebook has such a wide reach, but when it comes to doing something like a workshop, which would be more of a hands-on or clinic style thing, it's a different kind of audience. Anyway.
Well, you've plugged yours, I'll plug mine. It's always my least favorite part of the show, but let's give it a whirl. If you're listening to this on YouTube, if you haven't already, please hit that big red subscribe button. And you know what? Hit that bell notification icon right beside it so you get notified every time a new episode of Fans on the Run gets uploaded, or a new anything else I post, because I post other things too. If you're listening to this streaming, which a lot of you seem to do, please subscribe on whatever platform you have already. The show's available to stream, if you haven't been able to tell, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, Podbay, iHeartRadio, and probably 3.4 other billion platforms that I have no idea about, that Podbean just kind of signs me up for anyway. And wherever you listen to them, please rate us. Please rate us 5 stars. And if you We're on social media at Fans on the Run Podcast on both Facebook and Instagram, and we're Fans on the Run Pod on Twitter because we couldn't get the name. It wouldn't fit. And you know what? We're also, if you want to give some feedback or criticism or just compliments, because I like compliments, you can reach us at fansontheRunPodcast@gmail.com.
Have a cup of tea. So.
I would just like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming on the show today.
Very welcome. All right, then. And
to everyone else out there, I hope you've had a very happy day. Hope you've eaten maybe some turkey, if that's your bag, had some presents, and even if you don't celebrate Christmas, I hope you've had, a great day with your loved ones and family. And, thank you for listening. You can go home now.
Fans on the Run is produced by Ethan Alexander. Additional voiceovers by Richard Phillip. This is the Showtown production.